It was an early morning when I discovered something that would change everything. I had barely stepped out onto the porch with my first cup of coffee when I heard the frantic mewing from inside the barn. At first, I thought nothing of it maybe. It was the chickens acting up again, or the usual chatter from the goats. But then, Maple, my Persian cat, bolted from the barn, her eyes wide with a mix of worry and excitement. I quickly set my coffee down and walked towards the barn, wondering what had her so worked up. As I pushed open the creaky barn door, I was met with the most unexpected sight. There, nestled in a bed of hay, were 4 tiny bobcat cubs, no older than a few days. At first I blinked in confusion, thinking they were just some lost kittens. But as one of them turned its head and looked up at me with piercing yellow eyes, I knew instantly these weren't ordinary cats. They were wild, and the realization hit me hard. A wild bobcat mother had left her cubs in my barn. But the most shocking part there, curled around the cubs, was Maple, my Persian cat. She was grooming them, licking their tiny fragile bodies with the same tenderness she used for her own fur. It was as if she had known them all her life. Her gentle eyes met mine, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. I didn't know what to do. Should I call animal control or wildlife rescue? But as I stood there, frozen in disbelief, Maple nudged one of the cubs closer to her body, letting out a soft purr, as if to assure me everything was going to be okay. My heart raced as I realized she had taken these wild, helpless creatures under her wing. There was no mistaking it. Maple had become their mother. The cubs, though still tiny and weak, huddled against her warmth. Their fur, speckled with brown and black, contrasted sharply with the creamy white fur of Maple. One of them, a little more daring than the rest, crawled up to her chest and latched onto her fur as if she was its real mother. And in that moment, I understood. Maple wasn't just protecting them, she was raising them. How could I possibly separate them now? I stepped back outside, running my hands through my hair, trying to wrap my mind around what I had just witnessed. The whole town would soon find out, and I could already imagine the whispers starting. Did you hear that Persian cat's raising bobcats? It would be the talk of the town. But what did I really know about wild animals, and what was I supposed to do now? I took out my phone and called my sister, barely able to contain my laughter. You won't believe this, I said, still trying to process what had just happened. Maple's raising 4 bobcats. There was a pause on the other end, followed by a burst of laughter. I could hear the disbelief in her voice. Are you serious? She asked. Well, yes, I am, I replied. I don't know what to do. I think she's adopted them. That day, I made some calls. Wildlife rescue, veterinarians, animal experts seemed to have the same response. That's incredibly rare. One of the rescuers said, you might want to let them stay together, but it's not ideal. They're wild animals, after all. But Maple, with her gentle nature and fierce protectiveness, wasn't listening to anyone. She had made up her mind. She was their mother now, and I was going to have to accept it. The cubs' arrival had certainly shaken up my life, but I couldn't help but admire Maple's determination. She wasn't worried about the dangers these wild creatures might bring. She didn't hesitate or think twice about the risks. She simply took them in, loved them, and did what she could to protect them. And as the days went on, I watched in awe as Maple taught the cubs what it meant to be part of a family. Even if that family looked a little different from what we expected, but this wasn't going to be easy. Raising bobcats wasn't something I had prepared for. Their instincts were wild, and Maple, though patient, wasn't used to dealing with creatures that weren't domesticated. Over time, I would realize that this unusual family was about to face challenges I never could have imagined. The morning started like any other. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft orange glow over the pasture. Maple, my Persian cat, was lying lazily in her usual spot by the porch, basking in the warmth of the early sun. Her long, golden fur shimmered, and she stretched her body out with a contented purr. It was peaceful, calm, the kind of morning where time felt as if it stood still. But little did I know that today was going to be anything but ordinary. I had just stepped onto the porch with my coffee in hand when I heard a sudden, sharp barking. It wasn't Maple's usual lazy greeting to the birds or the goats. It was different, urgent. I glanced over at her, but she wasn't lounging anymore. She was up and running toward the barn, her tail straight and stiff, her body tense. I set my coffee down on the porch railing and followed her, my heart starting to beat faster. What was going on? I didn't know if it was a raccoon again or something else, but whatever it was, it had caused Maple to act like I had never seen her act before. There was an almost frantic energy about her as she bolted toward the barn. I hurried after her, my slippers slapping the gravel with each step. The barn doors creaked as I pushed them open, and the first thing I saw was Maple, her golden fur almost glowing in the soft light, sitting beside the hay, her eyes wide and alert, staring down at something. She was crouched protectively over something small, and it took me a moment to fully comprehend what I was looking at. 4 tiny, spotted creatures, no bigger than a few days old, were huddled around her. I blinked in disbelief at first. I thought they were kittens, maybe a stray had left them behind in the barn. But as my eyes adjusted, I saw them clearly. The pointed ears, the sleek bodies, the sharp alert eyes. These were not domestic kittens, they were wild. Bobcat cubs. I stood frozen in place, my mind racing to catch up with the situation. How did these wild cubs end up here? And why was Maple my sweet.com Persian cat caring for them like they were her own? Maple's eyes flicked toward me, and for a brief moment, I could swear she looked almost worried. She nuzzled one of the cubs, licking its tiny face with the same care she would have given one of her own kittens. The cubs, for their part, seemed unbothered by my presence. They huddled together, their tiny voices squeaking and whistling, clearly trying to make sense of the world around them. I walked closer, unsure of what to do. The scene before me felt surreal, like something out of a dream. The bobcat's eyes were wide, their bodies fragile and still, but there was a sense of confusion in them too. I wondered if they had been abandoned or if their mother had somehow gotten lost. The thought of a wild bobcat mother leaving her cubs possibly due to danger or injury struck me with a pang of sorrow. I knelt down beside Maple and the cubs, my hands trembling slightly as I reached out. As soon as my fingers brushed the cub's fur, Maple growled low in her throat. It wasn't aggressive, more like a warning. I pulled my hand back immediately, surprised. Maple had never growled at me before. Her protective instinct was in full force, and it seemed as though she was telling me loud and clear not to get too close. I sat on a nearby bucket, trying to collect my thoughts. Maple was not going to let anyone touch these cubs. She had claimed them as her own, and that was final. Watching her, I felt a sense of awe and confusion. Here was this gentle, domestic cat, caring for 4 wild creatures. How did this happen? Why was she doing this? Was it instinct, compassion, or was it something else entirely? The morning slipped away as I sat there in stunned silence, my eyes shifting between the cubs and Maple. The barn had never felt so quiet before. I could hear the distant sounds of the goats bleating and the chickens clucking, but inside the barn, there was only the soft sound of Maple's licking and the cubs' faint mews. I must have sat there for what seemed like an hour before I finally stood up. I couldn't just stay there forever. I needed to make a decision. I needed help. I needed someone to tell me what to do. I walked back to the house, still in disbelief. My mind was racing with questions. What was going to happen to these cubs? Could I keep them? Was it safe? And what about Maple? She was acting as if these cubs were her own. Was it right to let her continue raising them? I dialed the number of the local wildlife rescue, my hand shaking slightly as I held the phone to my ear. A woman's voice answered on the other end. Wildlife rescue, how can I help you? She asked. I think I need some help, I began, my voice a little unsteady. I found 4 bobcat cubs in my barn, and my cat is taken care of. Them, is that normal? The woman on the other end was silent for a moment before she responded. Bobcat cubs, you say? And your cat is raising them? She asked, her voice skeptical but curious. Well, it's not common, that's for sure. Bobcats are wild animals. It's rare for a domestic animal to care for them, but I suppose, in theory, if the cubs are abandoned and the cat is in a nurturing state, it's possible she could take them in. Should I do something about it? I asked, the uncertainty clear in my voice. Should I take them to a rescue center? The woman paused. We can come and assess the situation, she said, her voice calm. But until then, just try to leave them be. Don't touch them too much. They might be relocated to a rescue center, but it's hard to say if they'll survive. Wild animals have different needs than domestic ones. I thanked her and hung up, my mind still spinning. I didn't know what to do. Should I let Maple continue raising them, or was it best to separate them before something went wrong? I couldn't ignore the pull of instinct inside me that said these cubs needed Maple just as much as she needed them. But I didn't know if that was enough to protect them. By the time the sun was beginning to set, word had already gotten out. My neighbor Jim stopped by the house, looking both amused and concerned. Heard you've got wild cats in your barn, he said, raising an eyebrow. That's quite a situation you've got going on there. I gave him a tired smile. Yeah, definitely something, I replied. Maple's adopted them. Bonnie from the diner called later that evening. Can I bring my niece by to see the cubs? She asked, her voice full of excitement. I've never seen anything like that. No, Bonnie, I said firmly. These aren't just cute little animals to look at. They're scared and confused. They've just lost their mother, and they need peace, not a show. It wasn't long before the local curiosity turned into something more. People started whispering about the bobcats in my barn. They were fascinated, but no one understood the gravity of the situation, not yet. Anyway, that night I stayed by Maple's side in the barn, keeping a watchful eye on the cubs. The barn was quiet now, save for the gentle sounds of Maple cleaning her adopted children. I laid an old blanket across the hay and placed a water bowl near them, sitting on the floor beside Maple. It was a strange feeling, seeing these wild creatures nestled up against the soft, warm fur of my cat. Maple looked at me then, her eyes full of a quiet understanding. She wasn't just protecting these cubs, she was giving them a new life. And for the first time in my life, I understood the power of unconditional love. This was more than just a cat looking after her new family. This was something far deeper, and so began the journey of Maple and her wild cubs. The next few days passed in a blur of confusion, surprise, and wonder. At first I tried to convince myself that this was some temporary oddity, some strange twist of fate that would eventually work itself out. But Maple didn't seem to care about logic or reason. She had already made up her mind. These bobcat cubs were hers now. It started with the basics. Maple, ever the patient teacher, began showing the cubs how to find comfort. It wasn't just feeding them and keeping them warm. It was as though she had a deep, instinctual understanding of what they needed. She licked them clean, nuzzled them gently, and laid her body close to them at all times, making sure they felt the safety of her presence. Even when they cried out, their high-pitched squeaks echoing in the barn, she stayed calm, her tail flicking softly as she soothed them with a gentle purr. But as the days went on, things started to shift. The cubs, initially wary and fragile, began to respond to Maple. The smallest one, Poppy, would crawl under her belly, nestling in the warmth like it was the safest place in the world. Rusty, the boldest of the four, would playfully swat at Maple's tail, his tiny claws scratching her fur, which only made Maple lick him even more. Tough, the one who had bitten my boot that first morning, became the most energetic. He had a fire in his eyes, always climbing things or trying to sneak around the barn. Maple kept a careful eye on him, but always with patience, never reprimanding him too harshly. At first, the bond between Maple and the cubs seemed like a gentle, nurturing kind of love, but it was clear that there was something deeper going on. They were wild animals. After all, they needed to learn to survive, and Maple was teaching them, not just through care, but through action. By the fourth day, Rusty had learned to climb the hay bales. He clambered up them with a determination I had never seen in him before. Maple watched from the ground, her eyes narrowing, but she didn't interfere. When he reached the top, she gave a single bark, as if to say, "Well done." It wasn't a loud bark, but there was authority in it. Poppy was quieter, always staying closer to Maple. She would nibble on the pieces of hay, bat them around with her paws, or chase after small shadows that passed across the barn. But she was never far from Maple's side. There was a bond that seemed to grow with each passing day. It was clear that the cubs were starting to trust Maple, and Maple in turn trusted them. I spent most of my time watching them. There was something magical about it, all the way Maple seemed to understand the needs of these wild creatures, how her instincts were in perfect harmony with theirs. But as the cubs grew stronger, so too did their instincts. They began to test the boundaries of their environment. It was no longer just about staying close to Maple for warmth and security. Now, it was about exploring the world around them. One morning, I found Rusty perched on top of a stack of crates, his eyes scanning the barn. He looked like a little wild animal already, not the fragile cub I had found days ago. He stood tall, his back arched, his tail swishing with anticipation. Maple stood below, her eyes trained on him, watching carefully. She didn't bark this time, didn't intervene. She let him explore, only moving toward him when he teetered a little too close to the edge of the crates. I smiled to myself. It was a good sign. Rusty was gaining confidence, and Maple was teaching him how to be independent, even if it meant letting him take risks. Tough, on the other hand, was always on the move. He didn't stay still for long, darting across the barn, checking out every nook and cranny. One afternoon, I found him pacing near the chicken coop. I had to laugh as he stared at the chickens, eyes wide with curiosity. He crouched low, his body tense, clearly trying to figure out how to approach them. Maple was by his side in an instant, giving a soft bark that seemed to say, "Not yet, little one." She kept them in check, always watching over them with a quiet vigilance. But there was no doubt in my mind that Maple was teaching them more than just survival skills. She was teaching them love. She had opened her heart to these cubs, accepting them as her own without question. And in return, they had started to see her as their mother. But as the cubs grew, the challenges became greater. Maple wasn't just raising them to be gentle, domesticated creatures. She was raising them to be wild. She had to balance her nurturing instincts with the reality that they were wild animals, destined to return to the forest one day, and that balance was beginning to weigh on her. One afternoon, I noticed something unsettling. Tough had started to bite at the wood in the barn, gnawing on the beams with his sharp teeth. I watched as he tugged at the wood, his little growls growing louder with each bite. Maple watched him for a moment, her tail twitching, before she padded over to him. She didn't growl or snap at him. Instead, she gently nudged him away, her nose pressing softly against his side. He paused for a moment, looking up at her with confusion, then wandered off to explore something else. I could see that Maple was trying to guide them, to teach them where to go and where not to go. But at the same time, I could feel the tension building. These cubs were growing up fast, and their wild instincts were starting to take over. Later that day, I caught a glimpse of something that made my heart race. Rusty had managed to squeeze through a small crack in the barn door, and he was standing just outside, staring into the woods. I had never seen him so still before, his body tense, his eyes locked on something just beyond the trees. I rushed outside, calling his name, but he didn't move. It was like he was already beginning to understand what the world beyond the barn held. I felt a twinge of worry. The cubs were getting older, and soon, they would be too wild to stay in the barn. They would need to be out in the forest, learning how to hunt, how to survive on their own. Maple's time with them was limited, even though she didn't realize it yet. That night, as I sat with Maple and the cubs in the barn, I couldn't help but feel a sense of bittersweet pride. Maple had done something extraordinary. She had raised these wild creatures as her own, teaching them everything she could. But I knew, deep down, that the time was coming when they would have to leave. They couldn't stay here forever. For now, though, I would let them be. I would let them explore and grow, and I would continue to watch as Maple guided them through this strange, beautiful journey. Because no matter what happened next, I knew that Maple had done something that no one could ever forget she had. Shown the world that love, even from the most unexpected sources, could bridge the gap between wildness and warmth. And that was just the beginning. As the days stretched into weeks, the barn had started to feel different. No longer a place of quiet, it had become a bustling hub of energy and curiosity. The Bobcat cubs, once fragile and dependent, were growing faster than I had ever anticipated. Their tiny forms had stretched and strengthened, their eyes brighter, more alert, and their personalities becoming clearer with each passing day. The transformation was incredible. Rusty, the boldest and most adventurous, was always the first to push boundaries. He had become the leader of the group, always testing the limits, whether it was climbing to the highest point of the barn or darting out the door, always eager to explore beyond what Maple had deemed safe. The first time I saw him venture outside the barn, I was both worried and impressed. It was a windy afternoon when I caught him sneaking out, tail high, darting between the cracks in the barn doors. I quickly followed, my heart in my throat. He was standing just at the edge of the yard, staring into the woods. His small body was tense, his ears perked, listening for anything. He wasn't just a cub anymore, he was beginning to understand his place in the world. Maple, as always, was close by, though she kept her distance. She knew he needed to explore on his own, but she wasn't about to let him go too far. I called out to him softly, and he turned, his sharp eyes meeting mine. For a moment, I thought he would bolt back to the safety of the barn, but instead, he gave a small growl, almost as if he were asserting his independence, then turned back to the woods. I stood frozen, my heart racing. It was the moment I had both dreaded and expected, the moment when the cubs would no longer need Maple's protection. Poppy, the smallest of the cubs, was less adventurous but equally curious. She had a quiet, almost cautious nature, always staying close to Maple, watching the world around her from the safety of her mother's side. Yet, there were moments when she would surprise me. One afternoon, I found her sitting by the barn door, watching a butterfly flutter just out of reach. I stood still, watching her as she reached out, her tiny paws swatting at the air. It was a moment of pure innocence, a reminder that despite the growing wildness within them, they were still just babies. Tough, as always, was the troublemaker. He had a mischievous streak, always getting into things he wasn't supposed to. I would often find him climbing on top of the hay bales or swatting at the chickens through their wire fence. One time, I caught him trying to sneak into the goat pen, obviously thinking it was a game. The goats, of course, were not amused. They butted their heads against the fence, and Tough backed off, but not before giving them a look that said, "You'll never catch me." Maple, watching from a distance, let out a low growl, but it wasn't one of disapproval. It was a reminder that the cubs still had a lot to learn. And then there was Scout, the quietest and most elusive. Scout always found a way to disappear. He was the one who liked to sneak away from the group and hide in odd corners of the barn or behind the feed bins. He had a mysterious air about him, always watching, always calculating. There was something instinctive about him, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. He wasn't as bold as Rusty or as playful as Tough, but there was a quiet intelligence in his eyes that made me wonder just how soon he would be ready for the wild. Maple, of course, remained a constant presence. Her protective instincts were as strong as ever, but I could tell that even she was starting to realize that the cubs were changing. The bond between them and her was undeniable, but the time was quickly approaching when they would no longer need her guidance in the same way. She continued to care for them, cleaning their fur, guiding their play, and keeping them safe. But I could see the subtle shift in her behavior. She watched them more closely now, as if she were preparing herself for the inevitable. One evening, I caught sight of something that made my heart skip a beat. It was Rusty, climbing up one of the trees near the barn. He had managed to scale the trunk with remarkable speed, his claws digging into the bark as he made his way up to the first branch. I stood there, amazed, watching him. He looked down at me from his perch, his body balanced, his eyes full of purpose. Maple was nearby, her body tense, but not interfering. It was clear she was proud of him, but also a little wary. I realized then that the cubs weren't just growing, they were becoming more like the wild animals they were meant to be. It was an inevitable process, one I couldn't stop, no matter how much I wanted to keep them safe. They were developing instincts I couldn't teach them, learning things from Maple, but also from the world around them. That evening, I sat on the porch, watching as the cubs played in the yard, their movements becoming more coordinated, more confident. They were no longer the fragile creatures I had found in the barn. They were becoming strong, wild animals. Maple, as always, was nearby, her eyes constantly on them, her body always positioned between them and any potential danger. But even she seemed to understand that their time in the barn was coming to an end. The next morning, I decided it was time for the cubs to experience the woods in a way that wasn't confined to the edge of the yard. I opened the barn door wide, allowing them the freedom to roam. Rusty was the first to dart out, his body low to the ground, his tail swishing as he took in the new sense of the forest. Poppy hesitated for a moment, then followed, her small body moving with more grace than I had ever seen. Tough, of course, was right behind them, his playful nature taking over as he darted from one spot to the next. Scout, as usual, lagged behind, but I could see the curiosity in his eyes as he took slow, deliberate steps toward the trees. Maple watched them from the barn door, her body still for a brief moment. I thought she might follow them, but she stayed. Where she was, her eyes never leaving the cubs. I felt a lump form in my throat. It was a small moment, insignificant to most, but for me, it was the beginning of the end. The cubs were no longer babies. They were becoming something else, something I couldn't protect forever. Over the next few weeks, the cubs continued to grow. Their physical changes were striking. Their fur thickened, their limbs lengthened, and their movements became more fluid, more purposeful. I began to notice subtle changes in their behavior as well. Rusty's boldness had turned into something more like territoriality. He would stake out spots in the barn, claiming them as his own. Tuff's playfulness had started to evolve into hunting behavior. He would stalk the chickens, his body crouched low, eyes focused, ready to pounce. Poppy had become more independent, venturing further into the woods, though she always returned to Maple's side when she needed reassurance. And Scout had become the most mysterious of them all. I would often find him deep in the woods, watching from the shadows, his eyes glowing in the dark. It was as if he were already learning how to survive on his own. I knew then that the time for their release was drawing near. They had become more than just Maple's adopted children. They were wild animals, and they were ready to be free. But as I watched them one last time before I made the decision to let them go, I felt a deep sense of pride and sadness. The cubs had grown into strong, independent creatures, and Maple had done what I thought was impossible. She had raised them with love, patience, and care. But there was no denying that they were no longer her babies. They were bobcats, and they belonged in the wild. And so, the inevitable question hung in the air. How would Maple handle their departure? Would she accept it, or would she fight to keep them close, holding on to the family she had created? I didn't know the answer, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever happened next, Maple had shown me the true meaning of love, and it was something I would never forget. As the days passed, the transformation in the cubs became undeniable. No longer the small, fragile creatures I had found in the barn, they had grown into wild, independent beings, each one developing their own unique characteristics. But with their growth came a change in their behavior, one that left me with a sense of awe and apprehension. Rusty, once the bold adventurer, had turned into something of a leader. I watched him more and more as he tested his boundaries, straying further from the barn each time. He had a newfound confidence, as though he were beginning to understand that the forest was his natural habitat. I saw him pacing around the yard one morning, his small body tense, ears twitching at every noise. He was no longer just curious. He was hunting. His instincts had fully kicked in. One afternoon, I noticed Rusty crouching low in the grass. His body was perfectly still, eyes locked on something in the distance. I followed his gaze and saw a rabbit hopping near the edge of the woods. Rusty didn't move, didn't make a sound. He was waiting, watching, calculating. Then, in a flash of movement, he pounced, his claws extended, and before I could blink, the rabbit was in his grasp. I stood there, stunned, watching as he held the rabbit in his paws, his small mouth opening to clamp down on it. I had never seen anything like it. This wasn't just a cub playing. This was a predator, learning how to hunt. Maple, always nearby, observed the scene from a distance. She didn't interfere. She had been teaching them all along, guiding them, showing them how to interact with the world around them. But now, the cubs were learning from the world itself. It was a bittersweet moment. Maple had raised them, yes, but it was clear that they were beginning to forge their own paths. Rusty's hunting skills were improving every day. He would stalk anything that moved in the yard, a bird, a squirrel, or even the chickens that Maple had kept in the coop. I caught him a few times attempting to sneak up on them, but Maple, as always, was there to stop him. She would bark loudly and chase him back to the safety of the barn, her protective instincts never wavering. Yet even she seemed to understand that the time for her to intervene was running out. Poppy, on the other hand, was more cautious. She had never been the bold adventurer that Rusty was, and her more reserved nature remained constant. I found her one afternoon, sitting on the porch steps, watching the wind rustle through the leaves. There was a quiet wisdom in her eyes, as though she were observing the world around her, trying to understand it. She had always been the smallest, but she was no less capable. I could see it in the way she moved, now more confident, less reliant on Maple for comfort, but still very much a cub at heart. Tough, the mischievous one, had not changed in the slightest. If anything, his playful nature had only grown stronger with time. I often found him chasing his tail, climbing the wooden beams in the barn, or wrestling with Rusty. His energy was boundless, and his need to test limits was a constant source of both humor and frustration. But there was something else in his demeanor now, something wild. His nips had become sharper, his play more forceful. He no longer held back when roughhousing with the others. I had caught him a few times, growling at Scout, his posture defensive, as if he were asserting dominance. Scout, ever the elusive one, had begun to retreat further into the woods. It was as if he had become the most independent of them all. He was the first to disappear each time the cubs were let out to explore the yard. When I found him, he was always deep in the trees, his eyes glowing in the dim light, watching the world from the shadows. His quiet, calculating nature had become more pronounced. There was no doubt in my mind that Scout was already learning how to survive on his own. One evening, I watched as Scout made his way to the edge of the yard, his eyes locked on something in the distance. I followed his gaze and saw a hawk circling above. Without warning, Scout dropped low to the ground and slinked toward the tree line, his body moving in perfect silence. He was stalking the bird, though I knew it was far beyond his ability to catch it. Still, the fact that he was even attempting it was a sign that his instincts were sharpening, and that's when I noticed it. The shift. It wasn't just about the cubs growing up, it was about their nature changing. Their wildness, once subtle, was now impossible to ignore. They were becoming more like the creatures they were born to be. They weren't just imitating wild animals anymore. They were becoming wild animals, and it was happening faster than I had anticipated. I began to notice other signs too. Rusty and Tough had started marking their territory. It began with small gestures, like clawing at the tree trunks or rubbing their faces against the barn doors. But it quickly escalated. One morning, I found them chasing each other along the edge of the property, growling low in their throats, clearly testing their boundaries. When I called out to them, they ignored me. It was as if they were no longer listening to me the way they once did. They were listening to something else now something primal. I was sitting on the porch one evening when I heard Maples bark a sharp, urgent sound that immediately got my attention. I stood up and ran to the barn, my heart pounding in my chest. When I reached the door, I found Maple standing protectively in front of the cubs, her body tense. The cubs were huddled together, their eyes wide with fear. I followed her gaze and saw what she was watching. A large wild fox had wandered into the yard, its ears perked as it cautiously moved closer to the barn. The cubs were watching it, their bodies low to the ground, their instincts taking over. It was clear that they weren't afraid of the fox. They were sizing it up, evaluating whether it was a threat. Maple growled, stepping closer to the cubs, her body tense. She wasn't going to let them get too close. The fox, sensing her presence, stopped in its tracks and stared at her. For a long moment, the two animals locked eyes, each weighing the other. The tension in the air was thick, and I could feel my pulse quicken. Finally, the fox turned and bolted for the woods, disappearing into the trees. Maple relaxed, her tail flicking behind her as she turned to check on the cubs. But it was clear that things had changed. The cubs were no longer the helpless, abandoned creatures I had found in the barn. They were learning to survive on their own, and they were beginning to understand the wild world that surrounded them. The next few days were filled with similar moments when the cubs would encounter other animals, test their instincts, and show just how much they had grown. Rusty had started practicing his stalking skills on the chickens again, but this time, Maple didn't stop him. She merely watched as he crouched low, his eyes locked on his prey, and when he pounced, she didn't intervene, even though he missed. By a few inches, it was as if she knew that he had to learn on his own, that this was part of the process. Poppy, too, had started to venture further into the woods. She would follow the other cubs, but always at a distance, carefully observing their behavior before she took her own steps. She was still cautious, still more hesitant than the others. But there was a quiet determination in her eyes that hadn't been there before. It wasn't just their behavior that had changed. It was the way they moved, the way they interacted with the world. Their wildness was becoming more pronounced every day, and I knew that the time for their release was drawing near. But I also knew that it wasn't going to be easy. Maple had raised them, yes, but she wasn't their mother in the way they needed anymore. They were becoming creatures of the wild, and they had to go back to it. One evening, as I sat on the porch, watching the cubs play in the yard, I felt a deep sense of loss. The cubs had become something else, something wild, something free. And while I was proud of them, I couldn't help but feel that the time for Maple's influence was coming to an end. She still watched over them, still cared for them in her own way, but she was starting to pull back. She would no longer guide them with the same protective touch. She was giving them the space they needed to become who they were meant to be. I knew it was time. The cubs were ready, but that didn't make it any easier. The day they left would be the hardest day of all. As the cubs continued to grow, their transformation from helpless babies to wild independent creatures became more apparent every day. The shift was subtle at first, small changes in behavior, the increasing distance they kept from Maple, and their natural curiosity about the outside world. But there was a growing tension in the air, one that I couldn't ignore. The time for their release was coming, and I wasn't sure if I was ready for it. I stood on the porch one morning, watching them play in the yard. Rusty, with his newfound hunting instincts, was practicing his stalking skills again, crouching low in the grass and creeping toward a bird perched on the fence. Poppy, as always, was a bit more cautious, but she followed her siblings. Staying close to Maple, Tough was darting around like a blur, always getting into something new, while Scout, my elusive, quiet cub, was sitting at the edge of the woods, his eyes fixed on the distant trees. But Maple was there, as always, watching over them. She had been a constant presence, guiding them, teaching them, loving them, but I could see the subtle signs of her own struggle. She had raised them, and now they were ready to leave. She didn't need me to tell her this. She already knew, but I could see it in her eyes, the quiet understanding that her time with them was coming to an end. I sat down on the porch, the weight of the situation pressing heavily on my chest. The cubs had grown so much, and the bond between them and Maple was undeniable, but I knew that the bond they shared was not enough to keep them here forever. They were wild animals, and their instincts were pulling them further away from the safety of the barn and the warmth of Maple's care. The decision to release them was never going to be easy, but it was necessary. It was time for them to return to the wild, where they belonged. That afternoon, I called Caleb, the wildlife officer who had helped us when the cubs were first discovered. He had been checking in periodically, monitoring their progress and ensuring that they were healthy. I could tell from his voice that he had been expecting this call. "I think it's time," I said, trying to keep the emotion out of my voice. "They're ready, I'm ready. We just need to make sure we do this right." Caleb's voice was calm, reassuring. "You've done an incredible job. Maple has done an incredible job. But you're right. It's time. We'll start preparing them for the transition." He explained the process to me, and I listened carefully, knowing that there was still so much I didn't understand. The cubs had to be slowly weaned off their dependence on humans. It couldn't happen all at once. It had to be gradual. We couldn't just open the barn door and let them run free. That would be dangerous for them, and for the surrounding wildlife. "We'll need to set up a transition pen," Caleb explained. "Somewhere close to the forest, but far enough that they don't get too close to the house. They'll need to get used to the sounds of the forest, the smells, and the presence of other animals." I nodded, feeling the weight of the decision settling in. This wasn't just about opening the barn door and setting them free. This was about preparing them for the wild. It was about giving them the tools they needed to survive. But it was also about letting go, about realizing that these cubs, these creatures I had come to love, were not my responsibility anymore. They were Maple's legacy, and it was time for them to carry that legacy into the world on their own. The following week was filled with preparations. Caleb and I spent hours in the woods, scouting a location for the transition pen. It had to be close enough to the house that we could monitor them, but far enough away to give them the space they needed. The forest was dense, filled with tall trees and thick underbrush. We found the perfect spot, an area with plenty of cover, a small stream nearby, and enough room for the cubs to roam freely. The pen itself would be simple but secure. We used heavy-duty wire fencing, reinforced with thick posts to prevent the cubs from escaping. The idea was to create a space where the cubs could get used to being in the wild, but still feel safe enough to approach when they needed food or comfort. We set up a feeding area, but the food would be hidden in the underbrush. Forcing the cubs to learn how to hunt for themselves, it's not going to be easy, Caleb warned me as we finished setting up the pen. These cubs are still dependent on you and Maple. It's going to take time for them to adjust, and you might see some behaviors that make you uncomfortable. But this is the only way. I knew he was right. The cubs had been raised in a controlled environment, surrounded by humans and domestic animals. The wild was a completely different world, and they would need time to adapt. It wasn't just about teaching them how to hunt or how to navigate the woods, it was about teaching them how to be wild again. That as the days went by, I began the process of slowly weaning the cubs off human contact. I started by leaving food for them in the underbrush, hidden in places they would have to search for. I watched from a distance as they explored the new pen, sniffing the air, testing the boundaries, and gradually becoming more confident in their surroundings. Rusty, ever the leader, was the first to discover the food. He sniffed the air, his nose twitching, and then he bounded over to the spot where I had hidden the meat. It wasn't easy for him. He pawed at the dirt, dug through the leaves, and finally found the food. There was a moment of hesitation, as if he weren't sure whether to eat it or not, but then his instincts kicked in. He tore into the meat, his sharp teeth sinking into it with a ferocity that left me speechless. Tough and Poppy weren't far behind, though they were a bit more cautious. Tough prowled around the pen, his body low to the ground, as though trying to find another source of food. Poppy hesitated, sniffing the air, before slowly following her brothers. She wasn't as bold as Rusty, but she was learning. And Scout, as always, hung back, watching the others with a quiet intensity. Maple, too, was part of the process. She stayed close, watching her cubs as they explored the pen, but she didn't intervene. It was clear that she understood what was happening. She had been the one to teach them how to survive in the barn, and now she was allowing them To take the next step, the final few days before their release were the hardest. I could feel the weight of the situation more than ever. The cubs were ready, but I wasn't sure if I was. I had grown so attached to them, especially Rusty, who had become so much like a son to me, but I knew this was what had to be done. They were wild creatures, and they needed to be in the wild. On the morning of their release, I woke up early to find Maple sitting outside the barn, watching the woods with an intensity that I had never seen before. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft glow over the trees, and the air was filled with the sounds of birds chirping. It was a peaceful morning, but there was a sense of finality in the air. The cubs were waiting inside the barn, restless and eager to explore. I could hear their soft mews and the rustle of their paws on the hay. I took a deep breath, knowing that today was the day. It was time to let them go. I opened the barn door slowly, and one by one, the cubs stepped out into the world. Rusty was the first, his body low to the ground as he scanned the yard, his ears twitching at every sound. Poppy followed, her steps slower, more deliberate. Tough was next, his energy still as boundless as ever. And Scout, the quiet one, lingered at the door for a moment before stepping outside, his eyes wide with curiosity. Maple stood nearby, her eyes on them as they made their way toward the woods. She didn't bark, didn't call them back. She just watched, her body tense with a quiet sadness. I could see the understanding in her eyes. This was her legacy, and she had done what she could to prepare them for the world outside. I stood there watching them disappear into the trees, and for the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace. The cubs were where they belonged. Maple had done her job, and though it hurt to let them go, I knew that this was the way it was supposed to be. The days following the cubs' release were a mix of emptiness and quiet reflection. The barn, once a place of constant activity and warmth, now sat still. The sounds of tiny paws scampering across the floor, the cubs' playful growls, and the soothing purrs of Maple seemed like distant memories, fading with each passing day. The world had shifted again, but this time, it was final. I found myself on the porch more than I had ever been, sitting in silence, watching the trees and listening to the wind rustling through the leaves. The mornings were different now, less lively, yet somehow more peaceful. Maple, too, had become a little more subdued. She spent more time lying in the grass near the porch, her head resting on her paws as she stared out into the woods. At times, I caught her glancing toward the forest with a quiet look in her eyes, as though she was waiting for something. It was hard to tell whether she missed the cubs or whether she had come to terms with the reality that they had grown beyond her care. I wasn't sure I had fully accepted it myself. The truth was, I hadn't known what the release would feel like. The months of caring for the cubs, watching them grow, and seeing them develop into independent creatures had been an emotional roller coaster. I had known, deep down, that they couldn't stay with us forever, but that didn't make it any easier. As much as I tried to prepare myself for the day they would leave, the actual moment came with a weight I hadn't expected. They were wild, they were free, and they had their own place in the world now, but that didn't change the fact that they had been a part of my life in a way that would never be forgotten. Weeks turned into months, and life continued, albeit with a quiet sadness hanging in the air. The cubs were out there somewhere, living their lives in the wild, just as they were meant to. I held on to the hope that they were thriving, finding their way in the vast, untamed world. I tried not to worry, though it was hard not to wonder if they had found their way, if they remembered the lessons Maple had taught them, if they were safe. But that was the nature of wild creatures. They didn't need to be coddled. They had instincts, and those instincts were now their guide. I spent some of my days in the woods, quietly walking through the same trails I had walked with the cubs. It was peaceful, and I found comfort in the familiarity of the land, though it also felt emptier now. I would sometimes look up at the trees, imagining the cubs running through the underbrush, exploring the way they had when they were still with us. I imagined Rusty, with his bold personality, leading the way, and Tough, always causing a ruckus, following behind. I imagined Poppy, still cautious but learning, and Scout, always watching from the shadows, quietly calculating his next move. One afternoon, I found myself standing in the clearing where I had last seen them, just before they disappeared into the forest. The grass had grown taller, the flowers had bloomed and faded, and the trees had thickened with the passing seasons. Everything had changed, but in some ways, it felt as if nothing had changed at all. I sat down in the clearing, the place where the cubs had once played, and closed my eyes for a moment, letting the quiet of the forest fill me. It was then that I heard it, a rustle from the trees. A soft sound, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. I stood up slowly, my heart racing, unsure of what to expect. Was it just the wind? Was it a deer or another animal? But then, I saw a movement from the corner of my eye, something darting between the trees. A flash of fur, a glimmer of yellow eyes. I took a cautious step forward, my breath catching in my throat. And there, standing at the edge of the clearing, was a familiar figure. Rusty, his coat was thicker now, more mature, and his eyes gleamed with the wildness of a creature who had fully embraced his place in the world. He didn't come closer, but he didn't need to. He simply stood there, watching me, as if acknowledging that he recognized me. But but also acknowledging that he no longer belonged to this world. He belonged to the wild now, to the forest that had become his home. And then, just as quickly as he appeared, he disappeared back into the trees. My heart ached as I watched him go, but there was a sense of peace in the moment. He was alive, he was thriving, and Maple had done her job. She had raised them, and now they were living the life they were meant to live. The following days brought more sightings. I would catch glimpses of the cubs from time to time. Rusty, Poppy, Tough, and Scout, each one appearing briefly at the edge of the woods. Each one a little bigger, a little more confident, and a little more wild. I didn't approach them. I didn't try to call them back. I simply watched from a distance, my heart swelling with pride and bittersweet longing. Maple, too, had changed. She was still with me, but there was a calmness in her that hadn't been there before. She no longer waited by the edge of the woods, watching for the cubs to return. She had let go, just as I had. She knew they were where they needed to be. Remember one evening, sitting on the porch with Nancy, watching as Maple lay in the grass, her eyes half closed, her body relaxed. The sun was setting, casting a soft, golden light over the land. Nancy looked over at me, her expression thoughtful. "They've grown up, haven't they?" she said softly, as if reading my thoughts. I nodded. "They have. And Maple, she did it. She raised them." Nancy smiled, a wistful look in her eyes. "She gave them more than just food and shelter. She gave them love. She gave them a chance." And that was the truth. Maple had done more than just care for them. She had taught them, protected them, and loved them as though they were her own. And in return, they had grown strong and wild, ready to face the world on their own. The legacy of Maple and her cubs wasn't just about the physical care she had provided. It was about the love and guidance she had given them, the kind of love that transcends boundaries and helps create something wild, something beautiful. The months passed, the cubs began to fade from my daily thoughts, replaced by new rhythms of life. But the memories of them, of their tiny, fragile bodies, of the moments spent watching them grow and learn remained etched in my heart. And so did the memory of Maple, the cat who had raised 4 wild bobcat cubs without question, without fear. Her legacy lived on not just in the cubs, but in the way she had shown me what it meant to care for something without expecting anything in return. She had taught me that love was more than just protection. It was letting go when the time was right, and trusting that what you gave would live on in the world. One evening, Nancy and I sat on the porch, watching the stars as they began to appear. In the night sky, Maple was lying at our feet, content and peaceful. I thought about the cubs, about how far they had come, about the wildness that had shaped them, and I thought about how, one day, they would have cubs of their own, wild bobcats, born in the forest, raised in the ways of the wild. "They'll remember her," I said quietly. Nancy nodded. "Of course they will. The wild always remembers, and so do we." And so, the story of Maple and the cubs came full circle. They had gone on to lead their own lives, wild and free, just as they were meant to. Maple's legacy lived on in the forests, in the hearts of those who had witnessed her love for the cubs, and in the quiet knowledge that sometimes love means letting go. It was late one night when I awoke to the sound of scratching at the door. I opened it slowly, and there, standing just outside, was Maple, her coat worn and gray with age. She had lived a full life, and now, she was here to say goodbye. I knelt down beside her, my heart heavy with love and loss, and she rested her head on my lap, as if to say that she, too, had let go. The next morning, she was gone. But I knew, in my heart, that her legacy, her love, her wildness would live on forever, in the forest, in the cubs, and in the hearts of all who had known her.